If you're anything like I know I am, and you're a frequent viewer of this channel, you probably have a room full of action figures, full of shelves with action figures on them. Big part of the adult action figure collecting hobby is the ability to show them off, like trophies. A lot of us don't have shelves of trophies from when we were kids, but we sure have the entire Doom Patrol on our shelf. Exactly, it's like that. Now, while a lot of us are satisfied to line up our figures in what toy industry people call waiting for the bus poses on a shelf, a lot of collectors prefer having elements from the content. And so being able to set up figures on something like a sail barge or a Castle Grayskull is an opportunity to display figures within an environment. So what I want to talk about today, though, are these environments. Are these action figure play sets, or are they dollhouses? Now, you might jump and say, well, wait a minute, no, it's obviously an action figure playset. The Ninja Turtles don't live in a dollhouse. He-Man doesn't live in a dollhouse. But I want to talk today about what defines a playset and what's the difference between a playset and a dollhouse, because there is fundamental differences, and this is what goes into designing either one. Now, looking at dollhouses specifically, and this is something that goes back to kind of the Victorian age when they made huge replicas of their own home sometimes, to modern toys which are meant to replicate an environment. And yes, a home is often the most replicated dollhouse, hence the word house, and hence the word doll. Now, the difference between a doll and an action figure I've discussed previously, and it's just about how you play with it. Barbie, any doll, is nurturing play, or sort of Barbie has aspirational real-world play, like careers, whereas action figures are about aggressive play. Now, what about this? What about this Fisher-Price house from the 1970s? That's a house. Is it a play set? What about this other Fisher-Price 1970s? It's not a house, it's a building on a street. So is it a doll building, or, again, is this an action figure play set? Well, what about this other Sesame Street one? The one that has slides and cranks and little trap doors that spit you out in, different directions. The Cantina from HasLab? Is this just a bar-shaped dollhouse? Well, let's dive in and kind of look at the industry and the play patterns and the way, consumers interact with what are thought of as toy environments. So let's start off with kind of one of the most infamous, famous ones, the so-called greatest playset of all time, the original 1980s Castle Grayskull. All right, now you wouldn't probably consider this a dollhouse because, one, it's not a house, it's a castle, and it doesn't get occupied by dolls. Now, what about a modern Castle Grayskull? This one's pretty easy to understand whether it's a dollhouse or a playset because it has what defines a playset, and that is an action feature. When an environment has an action feature, whether it's a projectile, a crank, a slide, something that is not part of, say, real-world environments, but is fantastical in nature, that is a playset. So let's look at a couple examples. The Castle Grayskull from the Masters of the Universe Classics line that I proudly worked on, right? Showing a faux model next to the original vintage toy and saying, we're going to make the ultimate playset ever. But is this actually a playset? Well, looking at it with all of the different items, it has armor, it has chairs, it has an elevator that goes up and down, doors that open and close. Not that different from a Fisher-Price quote-unquote dollhouse, right? Or adventure house. Let's see. I mean, Castle Grayskull has opening doors that you can open manually and push and close. Fantastic. Well, so do most quote-unquote dollhouses have doors and windows, and in this case, a garage. Castle Grayskull doesn't have a garage. But does a garage make a house or castle? A garage makes not a I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that. The point is the door's open. All right. But the Classics castle did have a definitive action feature. The mechanism where you could push the sword into the rock and it would open up the door, quote-unquote, magically. This was to pay homage to the original play pattern that was designed where He-Man and Skeletor would try to get both halves of the power sword, complete the sword, then use it as a key to open the drawbridge of Castle Grayskull, go up inside the castle and flip open the flag, or flip it over to their side. Now, while the vintage castle did have sort of a homage to this by sticking the sword into the actual door and kind of just pushing to unlock it, The version from Classics was much more intricate. It actually had a mechanism. But you have to remember that the vintage Castle Grayskull, while it didn't have this mechanism in the door, it did have one of the best action features. It had the trap door. In fact, this mechanism was patented by Mattel. So this is what definitively makes the vintage Castle Grayskull a playset, is that feature. Paying homage again to the mini-comics. Well, the mini-comics were showing off the feature, but yes, this was, you twisted the chair, the trap door released. This wasn't just like pushing open a door. Now, let's look at something interesting. The Jabba the Hutt action playset, the vintage one of my favorite toys from when I was a kid. So, compared to the modern version, which was just released in 2024, that's when I'm recording this video, by the way, for those of you in the future, also called an action playset. But is it an action playset? Well, what made the vintage set an action playset? This is from a different video I did, so don't worry that my mouth is... Just turn the volume off. I wanted to show you this, though. There, see? That, the knob that opens up the grate, that is an action feature. So this is a piece of furniture with a slug monster, a robot, and a Muppet, and a hookah, because kids love hookahs. There's no action feature. How is it any different from, again, I keep using the Fisher-Price 1970s Little People, but it's such a good example. Here you have furniture. You have a bed. You have chairs. You have, pieces of furniture that occupy a room. Looking at some of the other Star Wars, quote-unquote, play sets, is this a play set? I mean, it's got opening and closing doors. Same with this. It's a hallway with opening and closing doors. I would call this a hallway-shaped dollhouse. There's no action features. Opening and closing doors are on dollhouses. You actually have to have some kind of mechanism, like on that Jabba. If you look at the sail barge, couldn't you say that this sail barge is a boat-shaped dollhouse, and that the Mos Eisley Cantina is a bar-shaped dollhouse? I think it's actually probably the best example. Yes, sure, it comes with, action figures or, little people, and it comes with lots of desks and chairs and tables and a bar. But again, how is this any different from this? I mean, there you have tables and chairs and pack-in figures and, there's no bar, but it's the same play pattern. Now, granted, something like this could be argued as a action figure playset, but they're outside of the mechanism in that little catapult. That's not part of, that's, more of a little vehicle that it comes with. There's no action. The Simpsons may look like play sets or dollhouses, but they're absolutely play sets because they have electronics. They have a mechanism when you hook an action figure up to it and press it in, versus something like the Death Star compactor from the Micro line. No action features. This is a dollhouse shaped like the Death Star. The Ninja Turtle sewer lair. Is this a dollhouse or a playset? At first glance, it definitely looks like a dollhouse, but there are mechanisms, trap doors, etc., that would make it more of a playset. Now, later, more modern Ninja Turtle quote-unquote playsets are much more playsets because they are loaded with what defines that playset: action features. Things that, like ropes and pulleys and, again, trap doors, all of these things that you wouldn't naturally find in a real-world environment, which is another way of looking at it, real world versus fantasy. Dollhouses tend to be real world, but not always. This Ninja Turtle playset is much closer to a dollhouse than a playset because there are no action features. It's just a building with ladders. So can you define that as a playset? Again, action figure doll, how you play with it, nurturing play versus aggressive play. But at the end of the day, the cantina, the sail barge, these are dollhouses shaped like things like boats and nightclubs or bars, whatever you want to call it. There's no feature. Jabba the Hutt had a feature in the original version with the flip open trap. The modern one, they're just kind of taking the name from the vintage figure, but this is not a playset. This is dollhouse furniture. And that is the difference between dollhouses and playsets. At least how the industry looks at them and kind of how they're talked about. Obviously, consumers have their own point of view. Let me know what you think. Do you own dollhouses? Do you own playsets? What's your favorite? What's the favorite playset dollhouse you had growing up? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you for sharing these videos. It's the best way to support this channel, and I will see you in the next video right here on Spector Creative.